Hi, everybody. And I want to thank you all for inviting me on here. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here. Healing the home front is what I'm calling this, connecting and reconnect. Because as we deploy, as we come back, whether we're a first responder going on a daily mission, or somebody that is deploying overseas for 6 days, we're always connecting and reconnecting. And we find that trauma, PTSD impacts relationships at home in a very negative way, and it makes connecting and reconnecting a lot harder. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. To get started, when you do dangerous things for a living, your emotional system copes by adapting to the danger. We human beings have been on Earth for 200,000 years or so. We have survived all kinds of dangerous situations because of our adaptations. So this idea that we have PTSD and it's a bad thing, there's a lot of negative that we think about it. But in fact, PTSD helps us do what we had to do. It helps us stay alive. And it's just that when we come back into a civilian or a home environment, a place where we're trying to have intimate relationships with a partner or a family or a child, it is not helpful. The reason it is not helpful is because trauma, whether it's full PTSD or not, prioritizes your physical safety over relationships. So even if I love someone, if I have a history of trauma, then I am always thinking about what that person might do to keep me physically, mentally, emotionally unsafe. And so all of these PTSD symptoms, and you may not have all of them, you may not have any of them, intrusive memories, avoidance. I think everybody on this podcast or webinar is familiar with the range of PTSD symptoms. In treating these, veterans and first responders, what I hear very often is, I don't really have PTSD. Doesn't really bother me. I'm not like that. I wasn't affected that way. I didn't see combat. The kind of things that you're thinking of that happened to me didn't actually happen to me. It wasn't that bad for me. So what my response is, okay, so no PTSD, no trauma, but your emotional system has been adapting to your environment since before you were born. If there was domestic violence between mom and dad, your emotional system was adapting to it way back then. Whatever you went through, if you had issues of childhood, that affected you. And so if you entered the military from a perfect family where you were always supported and loved and knew that you were safe, then you have a lot of resilience against the things that might drive you to some of these PTSD reactions. But most of us had different childhoods than that. Both parents working, maybe there was poverty. There's a lot of reasons that we have something other than the ideal childhood that makes us PTSD resilient. And I'm using the term PTSD, but I really mean trauma. I'll talk more about that in a moment. To get into the difference here, we think of ourselves as a human being, but for the purpose of this discussion, I want to break out the emotional system versus the cognitive system. People with a history of trauma or PTSD prefer to spend life in the cognitive lane. My thoughts, I like to be logical, I like to be factual, I like to make decisions based on what is observable. I like to be just a good, rational human being. There are a couple of problems with that. And with respect to the issue at hand here today, relationships, it's great to connect cognitively with someone, but a relationship is about an emotional connection. And so if we have, and there's a phrase, emotional numbing, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but the number we get, the harder it is to sustain a relationship because we're just not using that part of our brain. Why do we not use it? Well, the reason that we don't use it is because our emotional system is adapted to this history of trauma. By that I mean, when you are in places where bad things are going on around you, those tough emotions come up: fear, terror, horror. These are not emotions that we want to be with. And so the emotional system adapts by just tamping them down. And so our cognitive system, which remains intact, starts trying to run things. In therapy and in mental health, we talk about this thing called the cognitive triangle. Thoughts, what we think, right? I think I'll have a donut. Emotions, what we feel. I love this girl. Behavior, what we do. I'm going to ask this girl out for donuts, right? So these are the three things that kind of define who we are as human beings. What happens when we start getting emotionally numb? Well, emotional numbness in a clinical definition characterized by blankness or distance. And just like PTSD, we think of it as a binary. I either have PTSD or I don't. But in fact, think of it as like a tachometer or a speedometer on your car or a thermostat at home. It's a continuum. It goes from a little bit to very much a lot. And you probably know people that have a very, very heavy dose of PTSD, so heavy that they cannot function. And you may know other people that had some rough experiences, have some symptoms of trauma, but they do okay, and everything in between. So just because you were exposed to bad childhood, combat, on the job shooting, what have you, doesn't mean that you're full on PTSD. It means that you're just affected to some degree. I'm going to go back to how your emotional system's response to trauma is adaptive. If you fall apart, if you break down, if you cannot function in an intense environment where there's shooting going on, for example, or if you're in pursuit of a suspect, or if you're fighting a fire, losing it is dangerous, and you can hurt yourself, and you can allow others to get hurt because you fail in your own function. So this response, this trauma response, is adaptive. I want to just emphasize the fact that there's nothing wrong with you for being this way. It's an adaptive response to your circumstances. But when I come home, when I'm at the home front, now the problems come up because all of these trauma responses are not adapted to living at home and being with a partner. And so it is hard to close the emotional distance from family and friends. It's hard to listen and be understood. It's hard to be heard, and it's hard to listen. And then there's intimacy problems. Intimacy means more than just sex. By that I mean, that place where two human beings really let their guard down and share of the best and most sacred parts of themselves. If I've been through a lot of trauma, I myself am disconnected from that in me, and so I cannot share it because I have learned to protect that most intimate part of myself. It is the most vulnerable part of myself, and therefore it is the toughest to access. Problems parenting is, its own whole topic, but I wanted to mention it here. It's really tough when you're deployed and you come back and the kids have a relationship with your partner or a caregiver instead of you trying to have authority. If you have views, if I'm in the military, if I'm a first responder, that's a very hierarchical way of living. But families don't always operate that way. Partners don't always operate that way. And there might be real differences about how we're going to structure the home. And so if you don't get along with your partner, don't agree with your partner, that's an issue. Connecting with your children, that's an issue. But there's one more thing, and we should mention it. And did we mention anger management? I mean, what do you think happens when we stuff our emotions down? What do you think happens when we pretend we're not feeling or disconnect from them? Those feelings don't actually go away. They're just buried inside it. Some people use the word compartmentalize. Yeah, all that stuff happened to me, but I don't really think about it anymore. Oh, but it's there, and it's working. Hidden, waiting, and ready to explode. And this is why so many people that are first responders, that are veterans, that are active military, have this explosive temper. It's an interesting thing because they seem so, it just seems like they're grooving right along. They get along with everybody, they have the camaraderie is absolutely there. You feel like they're rock solid, reliable because they never want to show any stress. And all that stress is internalized. It's like a landmine. It just doesn't bother anybody until you step on it. And then when it gets triggered, it's really dangerous. So, kind of transitioning in this part of my talk, I'm getting to, near the end of it, I'm hoping to get some feedback from somebody. I want to answer the question, what can you do to better connect with yourself and those around you? And I thought I would just talk about a case study. As you might expect, the names have been changed. Everything's been changed about this to protect the innocent or the guilty or what have you. But the case that this is modeled on, it's a Marine veteran that I treated. He's got his 26-year-old wife. He married her a year ago. They have a 4-year-old kid. So the kid was produced before the marriage was. But our veteran does have PTSD. Interestingly enough, it's not from his Marine experience. He never was deployed. He never went out on deployment. It's from growing up in in an environment where everybody was drinking and using a lot of drugs. And so he was food insecure. He was housing insecure. He never had a sense of emotional safety. He was frequently undercut by his family. His dad made passes with, sometimes successfully, with girlfriends. And so the military was actually quite good for him. He enjoyed it. He loved it. And he found this girl, they fell in love, they had a baby. So how does this play out? So our Marine is the time bomb. He's waiting to go off. And, when he goes and, he's out and he's working, and he'll come back, and if he finds a candy wrapper in the car, he wants to know who she's been with. She may not have been with anybody. The thing is, how does she prove fidelity to a man who has learned that there isn't any such thing as a reliable, intimate connection? Really, really tough for him. Now, he doesn't beat her. I'm using the punching bag there. But there is verbal domestic abuse, verbal domestic violence. She's crazy about him. She's staying with him. She wants to be able to keep the family together to take care of the child, who is, of course, terrified. But this is, some of the details are changed, but the substance of this case is not changed. How do we make this family whole? How does the veteran take accountability for his own history and overcome it? And I think that all of you watching have probably had some exposure to ways to self-regulate. The classic is take some deep breaths, count for 100, take a workout, go for a walk around the block. All of those things are good but temporary ways to solve the problem. Over the long term, this is really probably the last thing I'm going to say because I feel like I've spoken for, well, I know I'm over my time limit, so that's another good reason for me to stop talking. But this journey to having a happy, healthy home, true intimacy with the ones that you love, starts with self-discovery, really leaning into who I am. It's tough if you have a history of trauma because the way that your brain is wired and your experience, the way you handle things, is to avoid conflict, to avoid trauma. But at home, every issue that gets avoided just gets swept under the rug. And pretty soon those piles under the rug start getting bigger and bigger to where there's no place left to walk around the home that's safe.